Hey there YouTube, welcome back to Artichoke Dip. My name is Rob, solo tabletop gamer. And to all my new subscribers out there, from the bottom of my heart, thank you guys very much for subscribing to my channel. And I felt as if it was time to do the dungeon video. I did one on the wilderness, and one of the things that I noticed about the wilderness video that I'm going to do different with the dungeon video is I'm going to make smaller videos. So at that point, I'm going to break those up. So if you guys want to go back and watch a particular video for the information, you can go straight to it rather than having to watch just one long block, because we're going to cover a lot of information. So I figured that'd be a better approach of doing it. So before I get into the video, if you liked the video, click the like button, and if you haven't subscribed, please subscribe. Click the little bell icon, and every time I upload a video, you're going to hear about it. Alright, so let's talk about dungeon and that word dungeon. So the first thing that pops to most people's minds is, well, fantasy role-playing game Dungeons & Dragons. But the word dungeon has been so overused in the fantasy tabletop role-playing game industry, if you will, that it's kind of vague as to what's the difference between a dungeon and a stronghold, or a cave system, or ruins, and what are those differences. And in this video, I'm going to get into those and explain to you the differences, how I use it for my gaming, and how that dungeon itself at that point can have other things to offer to your game rather than just a map and your characters to run around and encounter, because that's, you know, pretty much how I view the way that the industry is with dungeons. So the term dungeon, and I have talked about this in my other videos. So how I define a dungeon, and it doesn't matter what genre role-playing game system you're playing, whether it's high fantasy, whether it's modern horror, medieval fantasy, really doesn't matter. You know, that word has been used to describe a particular area with multiple rooms and intersecting corridors or hallways in which connect all of them, generally one entrance and one exit, or multiple entrances and some of them that are concealed. So that's a dungeon pretty much in a nutshell, how I define it. But let's take it to the next level. Let's break outside of that small box of thinking and look at the larger picture of the differences and how they can really make your game better. So the first thing, when you go to create a dungeon, and this is so important, is the dungeon setting. And what I mean by that is this an old stronghold your characters are going through? Is this an ancient ruin site they're going through? Because there's going to be differences. Is it a natural cave system? Or perhaps is it a cave system, maybe unknown to your characters, is really nothing more than a large insect burrow or animal burrow maybe they have not encountered yet, that they're unaware that exists in this world. Or is it a stronghold, a keep, what we call a castle, a tower, so on and so forth. And you can see what I'm talking about, how if you're playing a horror system and you're going through an old mansion in a modern horror system, that can be viewed as a dungeon. So let's talk about the different settings and how they're going to add more into your game. Even if you're a solo player or if you're a game master, you know, this will give you some food for thought to think about how to breathe life into the dungeon and make it a more living, breathing part of your game rather than just a map. So let's start at the top, and we'll say number one, let's talk about ruins. And so how I normally picture ruins in my mind and when I make them for my games is ruins are not an elaborate underground system like you would see with most published adventures of a dungeon map. Most parts of them are exposed on the surface with collapsing walls and areas that your characters go through. Some parts at that point are flooded with water, or due to collapses have certain areas that have blocked off, which pose at that point another challenge for the players to be able to find another entrance in. But generally with ruins, that whole idea, when you think of the system that you're using, that your characters are playing, and particularly medieval fantasy, if this is ruins and this is ancient compared to their time, what kind of ancient artifacts or magic or secrets are they going to find inside of this ruin? So what is the payoff? So ruins, to me, when I integrate those into my game, like I said, those are old, dilapidated, falling apart remnants of a pre-existing civilization that's normally off the beaten path, hidden away in a forest or whatever setting, generally away from everything and off the beaten path. And like I said, typically with ruins, crumbling walls, holes in walls, no ceilings, some of it subterranean, some of it above on the surface. I think you guys get the idea. So the second one is a stronghold. So a stronghold is a little bit different because with a stronghold, that was at that point constructed by a military force for that strategic area. Whether it be it's on a large hilltop that gives an advantage to be able to see farther out into the areas around on the map, or perhaps the stronghold was built at that point as a choke point on a large river for trading, what have you. There's typically, with a stronghold, as it was built by a military force, has a strategic point to it. And with that, it's going to be a whole lot different than, like I said, your cookie cutout dungeon. At that point, you're going to have larger areas to be able to go through. Because depending on the system, like I said, if you're playing modern, then we're going to think, well, they're going to have hangars for aircraft. They're going to have other areas for larger assault vehicles. If you're playing medieval fantasy, they're going to have horse stable areas. They're going to have barrack areas for soldiers. They're also going to have, at that point, lookout towers to be able to see an incoming assault at that point. And the entrance is going to be extremely hard to get past. It's going to have thick walls. It's going to have a very secure entry gate, which is going to pose another, at that point, challenge for the players to be able to get past to access into here. But also, inside that stronghold, there's probably going to be storage with provisions such as water, and that's another thing to think about. Generally, a stronghold, if it's built by a military force, is going to be put in an area in very close proximity to water, to a fresh water source. So that will also, at that point, lean towards, you may have areas, especially if you have subterranean areas, that may be underwater or flooded, particularly if nobody's been there for a while and it has been neglected and things have been taken over. But nevertheless, a stronghold, you should be able to find weapons, provisions, other gear that your characters can use for that story or the campaign. And those little tidbits of things that you think are insignificant at first, but really later on as the game goes on really do pay off and come in handy. So that's how I foresee a stronghold in my game system. So my third one is what I call a keep. And a keep is going to be like a wizard's tower. It's going to be an area that has been constructed by a non-military force to, at that point, not only protect the inhabitant, but also provide some comforts. And it's gonna be an area for storage, for living, and I'm gonna go with the explanation of the wizard tower. So with the wizard tower, you may find this in a very hidden, secluded area. It's more than likely going to be very hard to get in, especially if it's magically sealed. It could, you can see where I'm going with this. It poses a lot of challenges to the players, and even if you're a solo player, this is going to challenge, at that point, some obstacles for you that are going to make you think how to get past it. And that's part of the challenge of any of these, gaining access to any of these, is actually the entrance into it. You know, with published adventures, the one thing that I've noticed that's kind of funny is it's almost like the entrance to any one of these dungeons is so easy to get into. You know, it's like they have the big interstate road sign sitting there with a neon arrow going entrance, 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 you know, free admission. And it shouldn't be like that. That should be an area, if this is a subterranean area that your character's going in that is dangerous and filled with just peril, the entrance is probably going to be pretty hard to get past as well, to get into these areas. And there's going to have to be a certain payoff to, hey, let's go risk our lives and go into this subterranean area that we don't know anything about, and we may die within the first 5 feet. Sure. So anyways, I got off track there a little bit about entrances. So the keep is like a wizard's tower. So gaining entrance to the wizard's tower, then once you get in, you're probably going to have multiple levels, right? And anytime I've designed a wizard's tower, I've always found 4 levels is more than sufficient. And you can always go more than that. Now, each level could contain something different. One of the fun things that I love about designing wizard's towers, you can have one level that's the wizard's lavatory. And merely walking into that area could trigger an event. Looking at different vials of strange liquids, you know, could possibly summon something to that area. So that area to itself poses challenges to the players. Or if you're solo, to yourself. And then where is the sleeping quarters? Where are the sleeping quarters going to be? Where at that point is the wizard going to go and when he gets hungry and make himself a sandwich, right? He's got to have an area there, which is also going to give you more opportunities for provisions, for food, for rations that may be able to be collected and used later on in your game. So then, of course, how I do my last level is the observatory. It's towards the top of the tower, and at that point, there's probably going to be very unique stargazing tools that your characters are not going to understand. They're going to understand they're for a magical purpose and they're very expensive, and the components are going to be worth a lot of gold or lunars or whatever game system you're using at that point to be able to either loot for treasure or maybe answer some questions to themselves by looking at the heavens above. And all these ideas, and what I am really trying to emphasize here is, instead of just looking at a random dungeon with rooms and corridors, the whole entire concept of the area you're going into having a life of its own, having a certain feel and setting to it. So that's a keep. In my definition, that's what a keep is. Now, a keep doesn't have to be a wizard's tower. A keep could just be also a home with very fine furnishings. Perhaps it's a really nice cottage that's surrounded by a large security brick wall with, at that point, security spikes that come out of the top to try to keep intruders out. Nevertheless, that's how I categorize a keep. So the fourth one I'm going to go into is going to be a labyrinth. And it's very, very funny how you notice a lot of games don't really even touch on this anymore. Of course, they have the Minotaur. I mean, just about every single monster manual that you pick up for medieval fantasy and you open up, there's always a Minotaur in there. Whether it's RuneQuest, D&D, Labyrinth Lord, Four Against Darkness, Palladium, on and on and on and on. But yet, we have these elaborate dungeons, and somehow it seems like that's kind of like drifted away in the gaming, the modern gaming, I should say. But let's talk about a labyrinth and how cool a labyrinth really is. So, labyrinths can be very confusing and very fun, particularly for the solo RPG player. Even if you're using a multitude of random tables, you're in a labyrinth. There's going to be constant turns, dead ends, areas that may go up a level, down a level, other areas that may take you into a completely different part of the labyrinth, only to confuse you and turn you around, or there could be a trap at that point, not a lethal trap, but a trap that you could walk into that could change the perception of your characters. It could change as they walked in. It could be viewed as though it looks at an empty room with no exit, but yet they just walked into this area, but they can't find their way out. So at that point, they're really going to have to search and pull upon their resources to find an exit out of this area, only to find themselves further into a more confusing area of the labyrinth. And labyrinths work out really, really, really well for that. Now, every time I've used a labyrinth, and I've used them a couple of times in my games, of course, there's always more than one Minotaur that is at that point wandering through the labyrinth. But at the center of the labyrinth, there's something very profound. There's a reason why these Minotaurs are here protecting us, rather than, just, hey, let's go in here and go through this labyrinth for, kicks. Okay, why, there's got to be a payoff at that center. Whether it be an extremely, like I said, rare artifact, perhaps it's a magical scroll that this spell is rumored about by every magic user in your story world, rumored as a myth, but hidden in the center is where this scroll sits to be able to copy it into your spell book and for you to utilize it. So the payoff of the labyrinth should be big. It should be very big. Now, the encounters in the labyrinth, of course, you got your Minotaurs, but you're not limited to what you could put in there. And a labyrinth, you think about it, any setting you really want, you could have a very evil undead labyrinth that could hinge on like a necropolis, to where at that point your Minotaurs aren't flesh and bone, but they're skeletal Minotaurs, and you have humanoid skeletons roaming through this thing, trying to attack you and prevent you to getting towards the center of it, along with all the other encounters you can think of that are skeletal, or they could perhaps be specters, ghosts, wraiths, so on and so forth, which leans towards that setting thing. How to add that setting into whatever you're going through, whether it be a ruin, stronghold, a keep, a labyrinth, to add more into your game, to make it feel more than just a map on your table for your characters at that point to go through. So labyrinths are very, very, very unique unto themselves. And I think, to be honest with you, a labyrinth gives you more freedom than ruins would, stronghold, or keep, just because of the fact that it's a labyrinth. It's meant to be confusing. It's not going to make sense. Like I said, the layout of this structure is designed to confuse you and make you become disorientated and lost. So it works very well with random tables. Just constantly rolling dice and seeing which way to get towards the center. Now, let's get into, we talked about the labyrinth. Let's talk about castles a little bit. And so a castle, like a stronghold, obviously, is put there for military advantage. And the topography of your map should reflect that. It's going to be in a close proximity to water. At that point, there's probably going to be a lot of farms around it to support, at that point, the food for the king and all of his servants underneath him. And depending on the scope of your castle or kingdom, you're probably going to have a city within its walls, and then at the top you're going to have the castle represented there. And castles in my opinion, a campaign setting onto itself, because there's so much that's going to go into this. You're going to have to not only design the city, you're going to have to sit down and think of, at that point, the government. How is it ran? I mean, is this, do you foresee your kingdom being a democracy, or is it a monarchy? You're going to have decisions such as that. You're going to have decisions as currency trade. So for the rest of the world, one gold piece may be worth one gold piece, but for the fact that you're bringing it into this kingdom and they have taxes upon their gold, your one gold may only be worth half a gold because of the taxes. So with a castle, there's a lot that goes into a castle, or I should say a kingdom. I'll say kingdom. I'm going to divide those up into two categories. So let's say castle and then kingdom. So a castle itself, when you're designing that castle, you have to keep in the back of your mind, this is designed as a military strategic advantage. You're going to have multiple areas that are high up to be able to see far out into the surrounding areas for incoming siege at that point. You're going to have multiple areas that are going to give those archers an advantage to be able to fire beyond the walls to be able to take out incoming enemies. You're also going to have, obviously, the interior, which you're going to have thicker walls on the outside to protect the interior, to where the royal court's going to be in the event of war, where they can be, at that point, protected. And inside the castle, you're going to have multiple rooms and hallways and stairways, going up levels, going down levels. Now, most castles have that secret, at that point, tunnel system that goes beneath the castle and takes them way away that only a few know about. And that right there poses another interesting aspect to a castle, for the fact that not only do you have the castle and the thought of the castle, but now you have also attached to it this underground structure, basically, we'll call it dungeon, that attaches, that will at that point dump the characters maybe a mile away, maybe half a mile, maybe a quarter mile. It all depends on how you want to design it. And if this is an operating castle, this may be heavily guarded. It also may be an area to where they keep all their stores, or perhaps they keep wealth underneath there. But the point I'm getting at, it's going to be very heavily guarded. If this is an abandoned castle, the area is still probably going to be very difficult to find because the intentions was to keep it secret. But once you get into those areas, this same thing may apply. You may find stores and gear and wealth in those areas, but if it's an abandoned castle, and we'll put the strands of time, we'll say, has gone along, what has inhibited those areas to take them over and claim them for themselves? What has been looted? What's lingering down there, living in the depths of those areas that also pose more challenges to the characters? So I'm not going to go over the kingdom at this point. I think we kind of, I've explained kingdom, castle, that whole entire thing. So I've explained to you the ruins, stronghold, keep, labyrinth, castle, kingdom. Let's talk about cave systems and some of the differences of cave systems. So as your characters go through a cave system, when you design this thing, some of the things that are going to add into the setting and enrichen it for your game is take a few minutes and think about, how was this cave designed? I mean, was this through, at that point, thousands of years of glacial melting that has eroded these areas out, creating this cave system that now is inhibited by maybe dangerous subterranean creatures? Is this perceived as a cave system that's really, like I said, an insect borer? And this is interconnecting tunnels that is home to some large insect that maybe your characters haven't found yet. Is it the attempts of creating a mine, maybe? Perhaps dwarves have begun to mine this area out, only to find after getting a couple of miles into it, maybe they didn't find a gold vein or a silver vein to make the efforts pay off, and it's been abandoned and taken over by other things. Or depending on where this cave system is in an ice cave? Is just formed at that point from ice that you're walking through? So you have to ask yourself that question when it comes to cave systems. Cave systems can offer a lot and can breathe a lot into your games by just thinking about this. Now, the cool thing about the ice cave system is you could put a twist to your game to where this could be possibly 6 areas, right? Frozen under ice. But perhaps, in feet thick ice in the walls, there are, at that point, magical orbs that are luminescent and not only light this area up, but pulsate with power. And this is what, at that point, attracts all these evil encounters to this area and want to inhibit it, because at that point they're drawing off this magical energy. It's feeding, at that point, negativity to them that they so much crave. So there's some ideas to think about when you go to create an underground system. We're going to call it a cave system. And you kind of see where I'm coming from now, how that word dungeon is just very vaguely used to be able to say, here's a map. Okay, that's a map. That doesn't tell me, other than this is a map on my game table, my characters are going through it, and we already know there's going to be monsters in there. There might be a few traps in there, but beyond that, why is it there? Who built it? What is its purpose? Is this particular area I'm going through, does it have a, how should I put this, an aura of perhaps magic on it, whether it be good or evil, or was this area influenced by divine intervention and built by an ancient race at that point to appease their gods, and still within this area it resonates with this divinity? So those are all questions that if you take a few minutes to think about before you put this into your game, that setting itself begins to take on a life of its own and will breathe life into your game. And it'll also spark your imagination, get it going, because now your characters at that point are not venturing just through the cookie cutter dungeon. Now your characters are actually venturing through this system that has this rich history, and the structure itself at that point has an influence on your characters without the encounters, without the traps or whatever else you plan on putting in there. So there's just some ideas to think about. So I explained the differences between a ruin, a stronghold, a keep, a labyrinth, a castle, a kingdom, and a cave system. And all of these, if you were to draw something, simple 3 rooms, we'll say 2 rooms, just like this. Sorry guys, you can see that right there. Now as you look at it, before we could say, okay, it's a 2-room dungeon, but now this is taken on a little bit different life. At this point, you start thinking, well, are these ruins? Is this an area, subterranean area of a stronghold? Is this a subterranean area of a keep, to where at that point they may store provisions? Is this an area of a labyrinth? So on and so forth. So that's the first thing with dungeons that you have to, at that point, think about. And I think I brought up 7 different things for you to think about here, and to kind of process in the fact that what kind of area are they going through, right? So quick recap: ruins, stronghold, keep, labyrinth, castle, kingdom, and a cave system. So what I want to move on to next is the construction. What is it made out of? And this too also adds more complexity into this area and poses at that point more challenges to the characters. So we could always go with the first thing, which is I'm going to say typically when we hear of dungeon, the first thing a lot of people will think of from pulp culture, and that is, right, the old brick wall type of cave. Made out of brick, and somebody with a lot of time, effort, and resources decided to go underground and dig out this 20 levels of this elaborate system, and then put brick and mortar through the whole entire thing. It's your game table, so you. But anyways, is it made out of brick? Is it made out of something more natural, like stone, large field stones that are placed together to form the walls and the floor? Is it at that point just natural earth or natural stone, I'm going to say? So, and I'm going to get into one last dungeon, but I'm going to keep that with the natural stone, and that's going to be mines. And anyways, that's going to be its own separate thing I'm going to put on there. I'm going to put it on the list for mines. Alright. So you got brick and you got stone. You have natural stone that at that point this has been either eroded away or chiseled out. And then you have at that point soil, right? Natural earth. Just you could have ice. This could be made out of ice. This could also, at that point, it could be made out of perhaps, we'll say, wood timbers. So as your characters are going through this smaller area, maybe the walls have been shored up with large wooden timbers. So this right here, and the reason why I bring this up, the construction, is this is going to add more into some of the challenges your characters are going to at that point encounter. Now, if they're in a brick type of environment, at that point it's going to be very well thought out, it's going to be constructed well, everything's going to be held together with brick and mortar. So you're less likely to run into a cave-in in this situation because of, at that point, the complexity of the construction. At that point, it's probably going to be much easier for your characters to pull off move silent skill checks just for the fact that everything's made out of brick, and you're probably not going to have a whole lot of loose sand and gravel on the floor and everything. So that's some ideas to think about with the construction of the dungeon. The second one, stone. So stone's could pose some problems at that point. As your characters are moving through this area, there could be a percentage of a cave-in. These stones come loose and at that point cover some certain areas. Or as they're conducting battle, and at that point all of that noise you're making with the sound of clinking metal and the shoving one another, right, as you would expect in combat into these areas, and those sound waves at that point rolling through these areas could loosen up stones and cause cave-ins, whether it be where you're at, further down the corridor, so on and so forth. It could also be that that's in fact a trap. As you enter in an area, could trigger a trap that causes a cave-in, same end result. So stone at that point is, I love using stone for that reason. It could also be that the stone resonates with a certain magical power to amplify a spell. Perhaps there was something in this area you're going through at that point. Good example, my Necromancer, my 2nd edition D&D campaign that I'm playing, he entered this dungeon that was actually an old mine that these humans at that point started to mine out, and they ran into a large vein of black onyx. And this black onyx at that point was used for spells to the Shadow Realm, and it only amplified the spell at that point and still resonated with that power. And as they entered into that area at that point, because they were getting overran by monsters that had just taken that area over, not knowing about this black onyx, and my Necromancer at that point foolishly trying to see if there was anything skeletal remains in the area that could offer help, by using black speech at that point, it re-amplified that black onyx and opened up a portal to the Shadow Realm, and a shadow demon came out of that, haunting him and chasing him down to ultimately kill him. So there's some examples of how you can use stone to add more into your game, just with that thought. So the third one I get into is natural stone. Natural stone being, it is what it is. It's natural stone. This is perhaps an area that has been eroded out like a cave system through years of glacial melting that has created these areas subterranean out of the bedrock, and your characters are moving through there. The natural stone can also at that point add more into the game for the fact that perhaps this stone is extremely valuable in the marketplace for magic users. Perhaps they use this and sell it for certain spell components, and they can only get these rare minerals from this area. Some things to think about as you're building your dungeons. It could also be that perhaps this particular stone at that point resonates, we'll say, with its own power. And perhaps as your characters enter in there, that resonating power from that stone in that area at that point could be a natural portal to other realms of existence that they can only access in that particular area. So the fourth one I want to talk about, natural earth. So this is going to be literally, think about it, a hole that's burrowed through the earth. It's natural earth. It's loose. There's always the danger of a cave-in occurring. At that point, moving silently is going to be rather hard because unless you're walking on soft soil, you have to, at that point, consider there's going to be loose gravel and stones and so on and so forth. So as your characters move across these areas, they're going to be making a lot of noise, and it's going to be hard to be able to traverse these areas without making noise because the sound is going to be resonating off the walls and being echoing throughout the area. So there's some other ideas to think about and add into when you construct your dungeon. What are the materials made out of? The fifth one, ice. So if everything is made out of ice, or even we'll say hardened lava from volcanic activity long ago, what are these things at that point? How do they affect this area that they're in? Well, if you're in ice, it's going to be cold. It's going to be dang cold. So as your characters move through these areas, at that point, you have to constantly roll checks against your constitution to make sure that your characters aren't freezing to death. And on top of that, what unique encounters are going to live in these areas and call this thing home? And the ones that do are going to be very strong monsters, that are going to be forced to be trifled with, right? I mean, these things are just going to be brutal, to say the least. So, and as I mentioned earlier in the video, how is the ice there? I mean, let's say your characters are in a desert and or a tropical setting, and they stumble across this dungeon, if you will. And then the dungeon is completely made out of ice. So you're going to say, well, this isn't going to work out because I'm in a tropical, and it's, average temperature is, it can range anywhere from 85 with high humidity all the way up into the higher hundreds. How is ice possible? Well, what if there are magical, we'll say instrumentation or artifacts or a spell or whatever, some form of magic at that point that has created this small area to keep this ice here, and it resonates with that power, and merely walking into that, your characters are affected by this. Whether if you have a magic user character, it may help amplify their spells, it may diminish them, it could at that point slow your characters down. Maybe that resonance of power as they walk through these areas may slow their speeds, make them feel exhausted and drained. And at the same time, the encounters that are in there could have the opposite effect to them. It could make them feel extremely amped up and powerful. In the minute that they leave this area, they feel the opposite. They feel that loss of power, so they feel as strength is being drained from them, and they're not as powerful, if you will. So those are some ideas and thoughts to think about when you make your dungeon, some of the components to use to put into it, and how to basically make the area itself work for or against the characters, rather than just solely relying on the encounters in there. So, number 6, wooden timbers. So if you're going into an area that has wooden timbers, you're either entering an old mine area or perhaps a very crudely made underground labyrinth or dungeon, or however you want to look at it. And they're using the timbers at that point to shore up the earth from cave-ins. So that right there, like I said, is going to add to that complexity of your gaming. Cave-ins, some constant cave-ins. And with the cave-in, I know I don't want to make it all sound like you put this in here, your characters go in here, it's going to cave in and kill all of them. No, that's not. With the cave-in in these areas, could that cave-in at that point reveal a hidden location to another area within there, to where your characters at that point could go and search and perhaps find even more treasures, more cooler stuff, or perhaps to an area that's been undiscovered and forgotten about for thousands of years that may contain very, very rare metalworkings of armor and weapons and riches beyond their wildest dreams. So the wooden timber area, and the unique thing about it is when it comes to the wooden timber area, you know, that could have been built by any of the races that you have populating your game world, whether it be the humans, whether it be gnomes, dwarves, elves, and particularly dark elves I'm going to talk about here, so on and so forth, that could add into that. And you could even take that a step further, looking into the type of wood that was used. Is the wood that was used significant because perhaps that wood itself resonates with its own power? Perhaps it has had enchantments put on it at that point to protect the people that walk through, that may have a special amulet to protect them, but if you don't possess it, you're more prone to cave-ins. So I could sit here and ramble about this all day, the possibilities and stuff, but I'm not. So the last one I want to talk about, 7, is going to be lava rock, right? So if you have an underground system that's made out of, at that point, dried and cooled lava, creating, well, like you see in landscaping in real world, right? You know, those cool looking light stones, and if you throw it in water, they have a tendency to float and all that stuff. So if it's made out of lava rock, that at that point opens up the opportunity to add more into your adventure. The fact that you're walking through an area that has a lot of volcanic activity, and because of that, those lava flows could create or be constantly creating new areas as they move on into subterranean areas. In the areas that are cooled at that point, are going to give your characters the option to be able to move into those areas and perhaps find riches deep within the earth. Rare stones, minerals, veins of silver, gold, platinum, however you see it. Also, too, with that mind thought of lava, what inhabitants are going to live there? And, are you going to have a lava flow that may go so deep that it may go into the infernal realms? And at that point, you have an opening to where you have these horrific demons coming up through these areas and populating these areas. And if you do, at that point, they're going to start casting their own magic upon these areas, and those areas are going to begin to resonate with evil and perhaps their own symbology that they're going to put onto it. So I think with this video right here, I think we give you enough to think about the difference of the dungeons and the differences of the materials that they are made out of. Whether it be a rune, a stronghold, a keep, a labyrinth, a castle, a kingdom, a cave system, or mines. And I wanted to cover mines before I end this video because I said I was going to do that. So mines are unique onto other areas, particularly covering dungeons. So when it comes to a mine, and as your characters go through these areas, typically a mine can be a campaign setting unto itself, because as they go in here, these stones could resonate with power. There could be, at that point, large tears in the earth that go further down, deeper into shadow realms, infernal realms. They could span for, at that point, hundreds of miles deep beneath the earth that could take your characters at that point months, if not years, to be able to navigate, get through, and find their way back out. And on top of that, in a cave system, not a cave system, a mine system, typically as they go through these areas, they're finding natural water tables. So there's going to be its own ecology at that point deep beneath in these areas. They're going to have water, and where there's water, there's life. What do these areas attract as far as encounters? And there could be underground lakes, seas, so on and so forth. A whole entire new way of looking at gaming and giving you the opportunity to also create encounters unique to those specific areas. Encounters that you're not going to encounter anywhere else in your game world except for that particular area, because that particular depth of that mine, that water coming in, the nutrients that they're getting, perhaps the funguses that grow, all give into that specific, perfect, right, a mixture to create those particular encounters that can only be found there. So mines are very, very, very unique and to themselves what you can do with these things. Not only that, you also would have to think about the level of technology and sophistication that you want to put into the mines. Are we dealing with very primitive mining to where it's one floor going through, leading off into multiple areas, and at that point the workers at one point were either carrying or using wheelbarrows to get the whatever they were mining out? Or do they have elaborate gear systems at that point that move trolley cars or move mine carts that run across the ceiling through the entire complex to large conveyors that bring everything up to the surface? So there's a lot that goes into a mind at how, it's where I say a mind can be a campaign setting onto itself just because of that. Just because there is so much that you can put into this, and you can create worlds onto itself deep within the minds by just using a little bit of imagination. And as that mine was being constructed, perhaps an underground water table was hit. That underground water table over the years has created erosion, which has opened up a large fissure in the earth in which they're in, which has led to all these other areas that span hundreds of miles at that point, giving life to, like I said, unique encounters that can only be found in those areas. So, some things to give you guys to think about out there. When you go to make your dungeon, to really think about what kind of dungeon is it, and what is it made out of. In whatever it is made out of, how does that affect, at that point, the inhabitants or the encounters that live there, and how is it going to affect your characters as well. So I'm going to end this video right here, and then what I'm going to do is start on the second one at that point, and we're going to talk about the ideal dungeon size and how to start making some random tables for your dungeons. Alright guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, click the like button. If you have not subscribed, please click the subscribe button, hit the bell icon, and you will be notified every time I upload a new video. Alright guys, looking forward to seeing you in the next video.